On the Writing of Speculative Fiction by Robert A. Heinlein. There are 9 in 60 ways of constructing tribal lays, and every single one of them is right. Rudyard Kipling. There are at least 2 principal ways to write speculative fiction: write about people, or write about gadgets. There are other ways. Consider Stapledon's Last and First Men. Recall S. Fowler Wright's The World Below. But the gadget story and the human interest story comprise most of the field. Most science fiction stories are a mixture of the 2 types, but we will speak as if they were distinct, at which point I will chuck the gadget story aside, dust off my hands, and confine myself to the human interest story, that being the sort of story I myself write. I have nothing against the gadget story. I read it and enjoy it. It's just not my pigeon. I am told that this is a how-to-do-it symposium. I'll stick to what I know how to do. The editor suggested that I write on science fiction in the slicks. I shan't do so because it is not a separate subject. Several years ago, Will F. Jenkins said to me, "I'll let you in on a secret, Bob. Any story, science fiction or otherwise, if it is well written, can be sold to the slicks." Will himself has proved this, and so have many other writers: Wiley, Wells, Coyote, Doyle, Ertz, Noyes, many others. You may protest that these writers were able to sell science fiction to the high-pay markets because they were already well-known writers. It just ain't so, pal. On the contrary, they are well-known writers because they are skilled at their trade. When they have a science fiction story to write, they turn out a well-written story, and it sells to a high-pay market. An editor of a successful magazine will bounce a poorly written story from a name writer just as quickly as one from an unknown. Perhaps he will write a long letter of explanation and suggestion, knowing as he does that writers are as touchy as white leghorns, but he will bounce it. At most, prominence of the author's name might decide a borderline case. A short story stands a much better chance with the slicks if it is not more than 5,000 words long. A human interest story stands a better chance with the slicks than a gadget story does, because the human interest story usually appeals to a wider audience than does a gadget story. But this does not rule out the gadget story. Consider Note on Danger B in a recent Saturday Evening Post and Wiley's The Blunder, which appeared last year in Collier's. Let us consider what a story is and how to write one. Correction, how I write one. Remember Mr. Kipling's comment. A story is an account that is not necessarily true, but that is interesting to read. There are 3 main plots for the human interest story: Boy Meets Girl, The Little Tailor, and The Man Who Learned Better. Credit the last category to L. Ron Hubbard. I had thought for years that there were but 2 plots. He pointed out to me the 3rd type. Boy Meets Girl needs no definition, but don't disparage it. It reaches from the Iliad to John Taine's Time Stream. It's the greatest story of them all, and has never been sufficiently exploited in science fiction. To be sure, it appears in most SF stories. But how often is it dragged in by the hair, and how often is it the compelling and necessary element which creates and then solves the problem? It has great variety. Boy fails to meet girl. Boy meets girl too late. Boy meets too many girls. Boy loses girl. Boy and girl renounce love for higher purpose. Not science fiction? Here is a throwaway plot. You can have it free. Elderly man meets very young girl. They discover that they are perfectly adapted to each other, perfectly in love. Soulmates. Don't ask me how. It's up to you to make the thesis credible. If I'm going to have to write this story, I want to be paid for it. Now, to make it a science fiction story. Time travel? Okay. What time theory? Probable times? Classic theory, or what? Rejuvenation? Is this mating necessary to some greater end? Or vice versa? Or will you transcend the circumstances as C.L. Moore did in that tragic masterpiece, Bright Illusion? I've used it twice as tragedy and shall probably use it again. Go ahead and use it yourself. I did not invent it. It is a great story that has been kicking around for centuries. The Little Tailor. This is an omnibus for all stories about the little guy who becomes a big shot, or vice versa. The tag is from the fairy story. Examples: Dick Whittington, all of the Alger books, Little Caesar, Galactic Patrol, but not Grey Lensman, Mein Kampf, David in the Old Testament, It is the success story, or, in reverse, the story of tragic failure. The man who learned better, just what it sounds like. The story of a man who has one opinion, point of view, or evaluation at the beginning of the story, then acquires a new opinion or evaluation as a result of having his nose rubbed in some harsh facts. I'd been writing this story for years before Hubbard pointed out to me the structure of it. Examples: my Universe and Logic of Empire, Jack London's South of the Slot, Dickens's A Christmas Carol. The definition of a story as something interesting but not necessarily true is general enough to cover all writers, all stories, even James Joyce, if you find his stuff interesting. I don't. For me, a story of the sort I want to write is still further limited to this recipe. A man finds himself in circumstances which create a problem for him. In coping with this problem, the man is changed in some fashion inside himself. The story is over when the inner change is complete. The external incidents may go on indefinitely. People changing under stress. A lonely rich man learns comradeship in a hobo jungle. A milquetoast gets pushed too far and learns to fight. A strong man is crippled and has to adjust to it. A gossip learns to hold her tongue. A hard-boiled materialist gets acquainted with a ghost. A shrew is tamed. This is the story of character rather than incident. It's not everybody's dish, but for me it has more interest than the most overwhelming pure adventure story. It need not be unadventurous. The stress which produces the change in character can be wildly adventurous, and often is. But what has all this to do with science fiction? A great deal. Much so-called science fiction is not about human beings and their problems, consisting instead of a fictionalized framework, peopled by cardboard figures on which is hung an essay about the glorious future of technology. With due respect to Mr. Bellamy, Looking Backward is a perfect example of the fictionalized essay. I've done it myself. Solution Unsatisfactory is a fictionalized essay, written as such. Knowing that it would have to compete with real story, I used every device I could think of, some of them hardly admissible, to make it look like a story. Another type of fiction, alleged to be science fiction, is the story laid in the future, or on another planet, or in another dimension, or such, which could just as well have happened on Fifth Avenue in 1947. Change the costumes back to now, cut out the pseudoscientific double talk, and the blaster guns, and it turns out to be a straight adventure story, suitable with appropriate facelifting to any other pulp magazine on the newsstand. There is another type of honest-to-goodness science fiction story which is not usually regarded as science fiction, the story of people dealing with contemporary science or technology. We do not ordinarily mean this sort of story when we say science fiction. What we do mean is the speculative story, the story embodying the notion, just suppose, or what would happen if. In the speculative science fiction story, accepted science and established facts are extrapolated to produce a new situation, a new framework for human action. As a result of this new situation, new human problems are created, and our story is about how human beings cope with those new problems. The story is not about the new situation. It is about coping with problems arising out of the new situation. Let's gather up bits and define the Simon Pure science fiction story. 1. The conditions must be, in some respect, different from here and now, although the difference may lie only in an invention made in the course of the story. 2. The new conditions must be an essential part of the story. 3. The problem itself. The plot must be a human problem. 4. The human problem must be one which is created by or indispensably affected by the new conditions. 5. And, lastly, no established fact shall be violated. And, furthermore, when the story requires that a theory contrary to present accepted theory be used, the new theory should be rendered reasonably plausible, and it must include and explain established facts as satisfactorily as the one the author saw fit to junk. It may be far-fetched, it may seem fantastic, but it must not be at variance with observed facts, i.e., if you are going to assume that the human race descended from Martians, then you've got to explain our apparent close relationship to terrestrial anthropoid apes as well. Pardon me if I go on about this. I love to read science fiction, but violation of that last requirement gets me riled. Rocket ships should not make banked turns on empty space the way airplanes bank their turns on air. Lizards can't cross-breed with humans. The term space warp does not mean anything without elaborate explanation. Not everybody talking about heaven is going there, and there are a lot of people trying to write science fiction who haven't bothered to learn anything about science. Nor is there any excuse for them in these days of public libraries. You owe it to your readers, A, to bone up on the field of science you intend to introduce into your story. B, unless you yourself are well versed in that field, you should also persuade some expert in that field to read your story and criticize it before you offer it to an unsuspecting public. Unless you are willing to take this much trouble, please stick to a contemporary background you are familiar with. Paderewski had to practice. Sonia Heaney still works on her school figures. A doctor puts in many weary years before they will let him operate. Why should you be exempt from preparatory effort? The Simon Pure science fiction story. Examples of human problems arising out of extrapolations of present science. Biological warfare ruins the farmlands of the United States. How is Joe Dokes, a used car dealer, to feed his family? Interplanetary travel puts us in contact with a race able to read our thoughts. Is the testimony of such beings admissible as evidence in a murder trial? Men reach the moon. What is the attitude of the Security Council of the United Nations? Watch out for this one, and hold on to your hats. A complete technique for ectogenesis is developed. What is the effect on home, family, morals, religion? Aldous Huxley left lots of this field unplowed. Help yourself. And so on. I've limited myself to my notions about science fiction, but don't forget Mr. Kipling's comment. In any case, it isn't necessary to know how. Just go ahead and do it. Write what you like to read. If you have a yen for it, if you get a kick out of just imagine, if you love to think up new worlds, then come on in. The water's fine and there is plenty of room. But don't write to me to point out how I have violated my own rules in this story or that. I've violated all of them, and I would much rather try a new story than defend an old one. I'm told that these articles are supposed to be of some use to the reader. I have a guilty feeling that all of the above may have been more for my amusement than for your edification. Therefore, I shall chuck in, as a bonus, a group of practical, tested rules which, if followed meticulously, will prove rewarding to any writer. I shall assume that you can type, that you know the accepted commercial format or can be trusted to look it up and follow it, and that you always use new ribbons and clean type. Also, that you can spell and punctuate and can use grammar well enough to get by. These things are merely the word carpenter's sharp tools. He must add to them these business habits. 1. You must write. 2. You must finish what you start. 3. You must refrain from rewriting except to editorial order. 4. You must put it on the market. 5. You must keep it on the market until sold. The above 5 rules really have more to do with how to write speculative fiction than anything said above them. But they are amazingly hard to follow, which is why there are so few professional writers and so many aspirants, and which is why I am not afraid to give away the racket. But if you will follow them, it matters not how you write. You will find some editor somewhere, sometime, so unwary or so desperate for copy as to buy the worst old dog you or I or anybody else can throw at him.